So welcome to day 11 of the Sociology Guys 2022 challenge. This week we're looking at culture and identity, which is the kind of biggest challenge we've faced so far, because we've looked at education, we've looked at theory and method. Culture and identity is a subject area I've not taught for quite a long time, although it's not like I did do lots of work on it when I was at university and looking at culture and identity. So this is probably the biggest part of the challenge for me, is going through some of the options that I don't teach on a regular basis. So let's look at the questions. For those of you who are new to the challenge, what I do is I set a question, or I set two questions each morning worth 20 marks. And what I do is I then answer them by the evening. I either record a short video walkthrough like this, or I post the answers in print on my website, sociologyguy.com. So if we look at today's question, today's questions, I should say, were outline and explain two ways individuals are socialised into gender identities. Quite a nice straightforward question to ease me into this section on culture and identity. There's a lot of crossover in culture and identity with other aspects of sociology, because obviously sort of like culture and our identity form such a huge part of who we are. I actually find it a really fascinating module to study. But it's one I haven't taught for a while, so it's certainly sort of like something that is going to be a bit of a challenge on this 2022 challenge. The second question is an item question. Sociologists have argued that individuals often define themselves through their role in the process of production. Their ability to afford consumer goods, as well as what they contribute to society, form part of their identity. Okay, so we've got the question there as well. Apply material from item A, analyse two ways in which employment forms part of an individual's identity. Now remember, with the 10 mark apply and analyse questions, you have to draw information from the item and you have to make an explicit reference to it. Some people will tell you you'll be okay with an implicit reference. I just say don't take the chance. Make the explicit reference. All it is putting it in quotes, putting item A, and then using that hook to develop your answer. So your hook will be almost like a synonym of what is going on in the item, the theory or the concept that you are going to use to answer the question. But let's start with the first question. Outline and explain two ways individuals are socialised into gender identities. This one is a little bit more straightforward. Today I sent out a very brief sheet looking at some of the ways in which people are socialised into their gender identities. So there's the work of Anne Oakley, who talked about manipulation, canalisation, verbal appellations and differential activities, and how sort of like people are socialised into their gender identity at home through primary socialisation. Then you've got the work of Angela McRobbie, who looked at girls' magazines and looked at the role of the media in creating gender socialisation, so through secondary socialisation, and how girls' magazines reinforce the ideas about femininity, sort of like how girls should be pretty and how they should look to get a man. Then we've got the work of Raewyn Connell, who looked at hegemonic masculinity. And again, looking at the role of the media in creating this rough, tough action hero type of male that all boys should aspire to, or well, maybe not should aspire to, all boys do aspire to. You've also got the work of Skelton, who talked about gender socialisation in schools, how it maintains stereotypes and reinforcing primary gender socialisation. Lots of other bits that you can pull in from your educational module. Don't forget, in your educational module, you have to look at gender identity. So there is a lot of crossover there. You can talk about the work of Patcher. You can talk about the work of Epstein. You can talk about Mac and Guile and sort of like the crisis of masculinity as well. In there, you can talk about Rutherford and how sort of like masculinity is becoming feminized. Or can you? So these are some of the hints that I've put up. I've gone with primary and secondary socialisation as my reasons, and I'm going to go through them now. So, outline and explain two ways individuals are socialised into gender identities. One way individuals are socialised into their gender roles is through primary socialisation. Traditionally, males and females were socialised into gender roles through their same-sex parent, into the instrumental role and the expressive role, so for males and females. Oakley suggests that the family reinforces these roles through a range of different methods. Firstly, manipulation, whereby parents encourage gender-appropriate behaviour from their children. Second, through canalisation, providing toys and games that are gender-based, such as boys having cars and construction kits while girls have dolls. This is then reinforced through verbal appellations such as good girl and brave boy, which reinforce expectations of boys' and girls' behaviour. And finally, parents differentiate the activities they do with their children based upon their gender. For example, boys will help their father with DIY and maintenance tasks, while girls help with baking. Okay, so there's a really good, quite good analysis there. I've used basically one study and I've talked through how the process of gender socialisation, how the process of primary socialisation leads to the development of gender identities. I have put a little evaluation at the bottom. Some people will say on the outline and explain questions, don't evaluate. You're not going to lose marks for evaluating. It's a good habit to get into, particularly when you're looking at the 20-mark questions. So if you do have an evaluatory point on there, do not panic. Evaluation can form the part of good analysis. So I've put in here, however, critics would suggest that perhaps these ideas are outdated and that gender socialisation in the home is more gender neutral in the 21st century. We could debate that all day. Some people will say yes it is, some people will say no it isn't. The point is you've kind of made a criticism of that. If you haven't made a criticism, don't worry about it. I mean, I always sort of like pitch to students, try and evaluate. And so if they do evaluate on a question that doesn't ask for evaluation, they're not going to lose marks for it. But, you know, it might lose them a little bit of time, but it's not the end of the world. A second way in which individuals are socialised into their gender identities is through secondary socialisation, in particular education. In schools, girls are expected to be passive and obedient and often find themselves subject to negative attention from teachers when they deviate from this expected behaviour. If you've done the education module, this is stuff that we've covered in the education module. In fact, we may have even used this phrase when we did the education section of the 2022 challenge. Alternatively, boys will have lower expectations, and so teachers are less likely to intervene when boys display low-level disruptions. Within education, peers also perform the role of secondary socialisation, with boys being ridiculed for showing interest in education, as it is seen as part of the feminine domain, whilst girls are subject to being called masculine if they engage in sports, something that's in the masculine domain. Skelton argued that education creates and maintains these stereotypes and that they form part of the individual's gender identity as pupils go through the process of secondary socialisation. So you can see, I've highlighted the point, I've developed the point, how it happens, how it works, and what the impact of that is. And that's what analysis is. So there's 2 paragraphs there talking about primary and secondary socialisation and how they form gender identities. That's that question done. The second question looked at how employment shaped identity. I've just put up a few things here. There's lots of other things that you can go to. You can look at something like how employment facilitates consumption, which is a little bit what Jeannie talks about. Work produces individuals' identities through their economic and social status. Parker talked about how employment and leisure are linked, whether they are in opposition to one another. So if you work hard manual labour, you might spend more time in leisure. How they are an extension sometimes. How work then becomes almost you enjoy the work that much, and it's challenging that you take it home with you. And then there's sort of like the idea that some people are turning to their work for their leisure to make money, what we might call a side hustle, but at the same point in time they're actually turning their passions into earning money now, and that's Rojek. We can also go at this from the angle of how a lack of employment shapes identity. So when people don't have employment, how that impacts on their identity, because even though the item talks about how employment shapes identity, the absence of employment demonstrates the impact of employment on identity. So you could talk about Durkheim, lack of employment generates anomie, how people don't feel valued, how they don't feel all their norms and values have disappeared. They don't feel appreciated, don't feel as if they can contribute towards society. And also we've got Riach and Loretto looking at the loss of work and how it leads to loss of self-esteem and a crisis of confidence, and also how why people don't choose a lesser job than they had before. And this is because of this idea of a stigmatized status. They don't want to drop down the status ladder because people will make a judgment on them, and because at one point they were a banker and now they work in a call center, for example. Let's look at this question now. As it's an item question, we have to pick out the hooks. Here's the hooks I picked out: ability to afford consumer goods, and what they contribute towards society, and that's formed part of their identity. So a few things we can pick out here. Afford consumer goods, well, that links us into Gini. It links us into sort of like some of the other theories about consumption and how consumption shapes identity, because employment gives us money. Money helps us to buy things that form our identity. So you make that little chain there. I'm not going to do that one. How it looks at contributions to self-esteem. Now, I've kind of highlighted this in red because I'm going to use Riak and Loreto and talk about how a lack of self-esteem is the result of having no employment. So I'm going to flip this round. It's talking about how employment forms part of identity. I'm going to show you how you can use no employment and how that has a negative impact on somebody's identity, which proves that employment does have an impact on your identity, if that makes sense. Contribution to stigmatized status, might be able to throw that in there as well. We could have also gone down the route of professional classes and consumption, and sort of like how particularly the middle class and the upper class, because of their employment or because of their status in society, they may be able to consume more, and that gives them higher status and that gives them a better identity. And we could have also brought in anime as well. But let's look at where we're going with this. So, question 2, apply material from item A, analyse 2 ways in which employment forms part of an individual's identity. One way in which employment forms part of an individual's identity is through what they contribute to society, item A. So here we go. I've signposted to the examiner that I'm using the item. Bang. You know, it's almost like a little stamp on there that says, I've used the item. Great. Individual self-esteem is part of their identity, and this is often empowered by their role in the workforce. Many individuals define themselves by their job title, and evidence for this impact can be seen through the lack of employment. Riak and Loreto argue that individuals who are unemployed suffer from a loss of self-esteem, which they termed a crisis of personal confidence, due to their inability to contribute effectively towards society. Furthermore, they argue that older workers are often unwilling to take a step down due to the importance they place upon the status of their employment. Both of these concepts can help to explain the importance of employment in an individual's identity formation. Okay, so I've got a couple of big key concepts in there. Crisis of personal confidence, and this idea of stigmatized status. Although I've not mentioned stigmatized status, I've just said reduction in the status. Could have made it better by saying stigmatized status, I suppose. And I've shown that this is how employment causes, people to have status and self-esteem, and that shapes their identity. A second way in which employment forms part of an individual's identity is through their ability to afford consumer goods, item A. Again, nice little kind of signpost there for the examiner. Employment generates income, and this enables individuals to purchase the goods and services which form part of their identity, not only as a consumer, but as somebody who has a particular status within society. So the more you earn, the more things you can afford, the higher your status, and all of this shapes your identity. Gini argues that employment shapes identity not only through the interactions with those in the workforce, but also through the individual's ability to consume goods. Gini also argues that this impacts on other aspects of identity, such as lifestyle and leisure pursuits. Now, I'm going to back this up with Parker. This is supported by Parker's research into the connections between occupations and leisure time, suggesting that employment is a prime motivator in providing individuals with the means through which other aspects of their identity are formed. So we're saying that yes, employment does shape your identity, but it's one aspect of many, right? So you're showing that it is one part of it. You're really analysing the role of employment. You're not saying that employment is the be all and end all. You're saying it's part of a bigger picture. Okay, so that concludes day 11. So we're going to have a quick look at day 12's questions. Outline and explain 2 ways globalisation has shaped the formation of social class identities. Now, this type of question comes from 2 different spec points. The first one, globalisation and culture, is from the first spec point, which is on the AI information, but it's going to be quite difficult on these 10 markers to avoid not repeating information that's in the AI. And of course, social class identity. So how might globalization shape social class identities? I think if you hadn't done the culture and identity module, and you'd done sort of like, say, for example, education, there's a couple of ways in which you could pull this out here already. You could have maybe looked at sort of like the idea of the decline of traditional manufacturing and how that's had an impact on working class communities. There's one. How that then may have impacted on things like nationalism, and how we sort of like see higher levels of nationalism within some social classes. Question 2, sociologists argue that we live in a consumer society and our patterns of consumption reveal a lot about who we are. Additionally, some argue that individuals gain status from the goods they consume. A very similar question to what we've just been asked, only it's focusing on consumption now instead of employment, and it is from the same spec point, production and consumption. Applying material from item A, analyse 2 ways in which consumption shapes individual identities. Now, this can be the consumption of different social groups and sort of like how they consume and their patterns of consumption. It can be looking at the postmodern view that sort of like everything is labelled, everything is an image. Lots of different things you can look in there, but you've got to use that item. Okay, so that's it for day 11. Look forward to seeing you for day 12 for the answers to the 2022 challenge. Thanks for watching.